A black single father stepped into his own luxury hotel just after 11:30 p.m. wearing a faded black hoodie and worn-out jeans. His 7-year-old son was asleep on his shoulder, clutching a little stuffed elephant. He quietly asked for a room. The receptionist looked him up and down, smirked, then spoke loudly enough for everyone in the lobby to hear. "Sir, I don't think this hotel is the right place for you." Only a few minutes later, the same receptionist happily checked in a wealthy-looking couple who had walked in without a reservation. When the father calmly asked to speak with the manager, security was called. He was embarrassed in front of a crowded lobby filled with strangers who had no idea the man being escorted toward the door actually owned the entire hotel. Before sunrise, someone's career would be over. If you've ever been judged by your appearance before anyone knew your story, stay with us, because this ending changes everything. Daniel Brooks never planned to spend the night there. After nearly 4 months overseas inspecting new properties, all he wanted was a hot shower, a comfortable bed, and to make sure his son got some proper sleep. Their flight had been delayed for hours, and by the time they collected their luggage, it was almost midnight. Driving another hour home with an exhausted child didn't feel safe, so he made a simple decision without calling ahead. He already knew exactly where they were going. The Royal Crest Hotel downtown was the crown jewel of Brooks Hospitality, a business Daniel had spent 12 years building from a struggling neighborhood hotel into one of the city's most respected luxury brands. He had personally opened the property and reminded every employee on opening day that every guest deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. What none of them knew was that the man standing in the hoodie was the owner they had never met. Daniel believed there was only one honest way to know how a hotel truly treated its guests. He never announced his visits. Whenever he inspected one of his properties, he arrived looking like any ordinary traveler. No expensive watch, no designer suitcase, just a faded black hoodie, worn jeans, comfortable sneakers, and a tired smile after a long journey. That was how he separated genuine hospitality from polished performances. His late father had worked the overnight security shift at a neighborhood hotel for more than 20 years, and one lesson stayed with Daniel long after he was gone. You learn everything about a business by watching how it treats the people it believes have nothing to offer. Not the wealthy guests it hopes will return. The ones it thinks no one is paying attention to. Ethan had fallen asleep somewhere over the ocean and hadn't opened his eyes since. At just 7 years old, he felt featherlight in Daniel's arms, but after months apart because of business travel, Daniel would have carried him twice as far without a single complaint. The little boy had his mother's gentle smile and his father's determination. His tiny arms rested loosely around Daniel's neck while his worn stuffed elephant, Oliver, was tucked safely beneath his chin. Holding Ethan with one arm, Daniel pushed through the revolving doors with the other. The lobby of the Royal Crest looked exactly as he remembered. Soft golden lighting reflected across polished marble floors, while quiet piano music drifted through the air from the lounge nearby. The long walnut reception desk stood beneath sparkling chandeliers, creating the welcoming atmosphere Daniel had personally approved years earlier. He had reviewed every detail of the design himself because he wanted every guest to feel valued the moment they walked inside. Walking carefully so he wouldn't wake Ethan, Daniel approached the front desk. The overnight receptionist looked to be in his late 20s, dressed neatly in the hotel's navy uniform, every button perfectly fastened, his name badge shining beneath the lobby lights. From the moment their eyes met, Daniel noticed something that made him pause. Not kindness, judgment. And within the next few minutes, that first impression would change both of their lives forever. The employee's name tag read Tyler. As Daniel stepped closer to the counter, Tyler looked up from his computer. For a split second, his expression shifted. Not with open hostility, just the quiet kind of judgment that flashes across someone's face before they even realize they're making a decision. His eyes moved from Daniel's faded hoodie to the sleeping little boy resting on his shoulder, then back to the reservation screen. "Good evening," Daniel said politely. "I'd like a room for tonight. 1 room. 2 guests. Nothing fancy. We just need a place to rest." Tyler's fingers paused above the keyboard a little longer than necessary. Then he leaned forward slightly and lowered his voice just enough for the people nearby to hear. "Sir, this hotel isn't really the kind of place people just walk into." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They carried the quiet confidence of someone who believed he had already decided exactly where Daniel belonged. A businessman sitting near the lounge looked up from his coffee. Another guest glanced over before quickly looking away. Daniel never turned toward either of them. His eyes stayed on Tyler. "I'm only asking for a room," he replied calmly. "That's all." Tyler straightened his tie and forced a professional smile. "I'm sorry, sir. We are completely booked tonight. There isn't a single room available." Daniel's expression never changed. "Not even a standard room?" he asked. "My son is exhausted. We only need somewhere to sleep until morning." Tyler shook his head without checking the system again. "I'm afraid not. You may want to try another hotel a few blocks from here." For several seconds, Daniel simply stood there, not arguing, not raising his voice, just quietly watching Tyler, carefully taking in every word, every expression, and every decision. Then, less than 3 minutes later, the revolving doors opened again. A sharply dressed couple walked into the lobby, laughing as they rolled 2 designer suitcases across the marble floor. Daniel remained exactly where he was, and watched what happened next. The couple walked confidently across the lobby. The man wore a tailored charcoal suit, while the woman carried an elegant designer handbag that looked like it had never touched the floor. They moved with the quiet confidence of people who assumed the best room in the building would always be waiting for them. Daniel stepped aside without saying a word. Tyler's entire demeanor changed. His shoulders relaxed. A broad smile spread across his face. "Good evening, and welcome to the Royal Crest Hotel," he said cheerfully. "Do you have a reservation with us tonight?" The man laughed. "No, we decided to stop in on the drive over." "Not a problem at all," Tyler replied. "Let's get you taken care of." Within minutes, he located a room, processed the payment, and handed over 2 key cards with the kind of warmth Daniel had been denied only moments earlier. Daniel watched every second in silence. He didn't interrupt. He didn't have to. The truth had revealed itself without anyone saying it aloud. Ethan shifted slightly against his shoulder, his sleepy voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, are we staying here?" Daniel gently adjusted the little boy in his arms. "We are here, buddy," he said softly. "Just give me another minute." Then he turned back toward the front desk. His voice remained calm, but there was now a firmness beneath it. "I'd like to speak with the manager on duty for the first time that evening." Tyler hesitated. The confident smile faded for just a second before he quickly forced it back. "Certainly," he replied, reaching for the desk phone. He made a brief call, spoke quietly, and hung up. "It'll only be a moment." Daniel nodded and waited. As the seconds passed, he glanced around the lobby. A concierge pretended to organize brochures while secretly watching the exchange. A bell attendant slowed his pace as he rolled a luggage cart by. Even the pianist in the lounge seemed to notice that something unusual was unfolding. Daniel looked across the polished marble floors and warm lighting that filled the lobby. Years earlier, he had approved every detail of this space himself. He wanted every guest, no matter who they were or what they looked like, to feel welcome the moment they walked through those doors. Tonight, standing there with his son asleep in his arms, he wondered how far that promise had drifted from the people trusted to protect it. And in less than a minute, the manager stepped out of the office. His name tag read Victor Hayes. He looked to be in his late 40s, dressed in a perfectly pressed charcoal suit. The kind of man who believed authority wasn't something you announced, it was something people noticed the moment you walked into a room. By the time he reached the front desk, someone had clearly filled him in. Not with the facts. With an opinion. "Good evening, Sir," Victor said, positioning himself beside the receptionist instead of across from Daniel. The choice was subtle, but it drew an invisible line between them. "I understand there's been a misunderstanding." Daniel met his eyes. "I don't believe there has." Victor forced a courteous smile. "My associate has already explained that we are completely booked for the evening. Unfortunately, there's nothing more we can do." Daniel's expression never changed. He slowly glanced toward the elevators where the couple had disappeared only moments earlier. They didn't have a reservation. Victor followed his gaze for a split second before looking back. Our staff exercised their professional judgment. Daniel nodded once. So that's the explanation you're choosing to stand behind. Neither man spoke. For several long seconds, the only sound in the lobby was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Daniel thought about his father. He remembered the countless nights his dad came home exhausted after working double shifts, his hands rough from years of honest work. He never complained. He simply believed that every person deserved to be treated with dignity, no matter how they looked or what they were wearing. That lesson had stayed with Daniel long after his father was gone. Standing inside the lobby of his own flagship hotel, holding his sleeping son, he felt that memory settle over him once again. Not as anger, as clarity. He wasn't going to tell them who he was. Not yet. Because if this could happen to him, how many ordinary families had walked through these same doors and quietly accepted the same humiliation? And if this was happening inside the Royal Crest Hotel, what else had been happening across Brooks Hospitality while no one was watching? Daniel didn't move. He simply looked at Victor the way a man looks at a puzzle he has already begun solving. Not for his own satisfaction, but because if this was happening inside the hotel that carried his family's name, he needed to know how deep it went before he changed anything. "I'd like your full name," Daniel said quietly, "and your exact position here." Victor hesitated. It wasn't the request that caught him off guard. It was the confidence behind it. Most people, after being turned away, either argued or left. This man did neither. "Victor Hayes," he answered at last. "General Manager." Daniel nodded once. Then his eyes shifted to the receptionist. "And yours?" Tyler swallowed. "Tyler Benson, overnight front desk associate." Daniel repeated both names under his breath, committing them to memory the way he had done thousands of times throughout his career. Names mattered, not because of titles, but because every decision was attached to someone willing to make it. He stepped back from the counter without another word. Ethan shifted slightly against his shoulder, still asleep, his small hand tightening around the stuffed elephant. Daniel adjusted the blanket around the little boy before taking a seat in one of the leather chairs overlooking the lobby. He wasn't leaving. Not yet. Victor noticed. Tyler noticed. So did everyone else. The lobby had become unusually quiet. The concierge kept pretending to organize brochures, though the same stack had been arranged 3 different times. A bell attendant slowed his cart every time he passed the front desk. Even 2 guests near the lounge had stopped talking altogether. They weren't watching a confrontation. They were waiting for one. It never came. Daniel simply sat there, patient, observing. Victor folded his arms near the reception desk. Every few moments, his eyes drifted toward Daniel. Each glance lasted a little longer than the last. There was something about the man in the faded hoodie that refused to fit the story he had already decided was true. Daniel noticed every look, every whisper, every uneasy shift behind the desk. He had seen this before. Not in this hotel. At least, he hoped not. But in enough businesses to recognize the pattern almost immediately. People grew uncomfortable when they realized someone wasn't reacting the way they expected. And tonight, everyone in the lobby was beginning to wonder the same thing. Why hadn't he left? Daniel remained exactly where he was. His hand rested gently against Ethan's back, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his son's breathing. The little boy hadn't stirred once. Daniel quietly adjusted the stuffed elephant tucked beneath Ethan's chin, and kept watching. Victor eventually made his decision. He crossed the marble lobby with the measured confidence of someone who believed authority alone could end an uncomfortable situation. He stopped several feet from Daniel's chair, close enough to command attention, far enough to avoid looking confrontational. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, soft enough to sound professional, loud enough for nearby guests to hear every word. Sir Victor began. I've allowed you a few minutes because I understand you're traveling with a child. He glanced briefly toward Ethan before looking back at Daniel. But we've already explained that we aren't able to accommodate you tonight. He paused. I'll also have to ask that you stop occupying the lobby. Daniel slowly lifted his eyes. Not with irritation. Not with surprise. Only with the quiet patience of a man listening very carefully. I'm sitting in a chair, he said evenly. My son is asleep. I haven't raised my voice. I haven't disturbed your guests. And I haven't done anything that would justify asking us to leave. For a moment, no one spoke. The businessman near the lounge quietly lowered his coffee cup onto its saucer. The soft clink echoed farther than it should have. The concierge looked up. Hen immediately looked back down again. Tyler shifted uneasily behind the front desk. He had expected an argument. Instead, he found himself listening to a man who sounded completely certain he was standing on solid ground. Victor noticed it too. There wasn't a trace of desperation in Daniel's voice. No pleading. No frustration. Only the calm certainty of someone who never once questioned whether he belonged exactly where he was. Something about that certainty unsettled him. Not fear. Something older than fear. Doubt. It settled quietly into the back of his mind. And refused to leave. Victor drew a slow breath. Then he looked toward the far end of the lobby. I think it's time we involve security. Tyler hesitated, but reached for the radio anyway. Within seconds, 2 uniformed security officers stepped out from a hallway near the elevators. Neither hurried. Neither looked angry. They simply walked with the practiced confidence of men responding to a routine call. Guests throughout the lobby began pretending not to watch, but almost every pair of eyes followed the officers as they made their way toward Daniel. And through it all, Daniel never moved. He simply rested one hand on Ethan's back and waited to see what they would do next. It was at that exact moment that Ethan opened his eyes. Children didn't wake the way adults did. Not slowly. Not cautiously. One blink. And suddenly he was completely awake. He looked at the bright lobby. The 2 security officers standing nearby. The worried faces behind the front desk. And finally up at his father. His small hand tightened around Oliver, the worn stuffed elephant he had carried since he was 3. Dad. His voice was quiet. Sleepy. Completely unaware of the tension surrounding them. Daniel looked down and smiled. Hey buddy. Ethan rubbed one eye before looking at the security officers again. Then back at Daniel. Are we leaving? Daniel gently adjusted him on his shoulder. Not yet. The answer seemed to satisfy Ethan. For about 3 seconds. Then he looked directly at Victor. His young face filled with the simple curiosity that only children possess. Why do they want us to go? His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. In the quiet lobby, every word carried. The businessman near the lounge slowly lowered his newspaper. The couple Tyler had checked in only minutes earlier had stopped walking toward the elevators. Even Maya at the concierge desk froze, her hands resting motionless on the polished counter. Victor opened his mouth, then closed it again. No answer sounded right when spoken to a 7-year-old. Ethan looked back at his father, then back at Victor. His forehead wrinkled as he tried to understand. I thought hotels were for people who needed somewhere to sleep. The question wasn't meant to embarrass anyone. It wasn't an accusation. It was simply the honest logic of a child trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense at all. And somehow, that made it far more difficult to answer. No one in the lobby spoke. Not Tyler. Not Victor. Not the security officers. Daniel rested one hand gently against Ethan's back. His voice remained calm. You didn't do anything wrong, buddy. Ethan nodded slowly. I know. Then he looked at the 2 security officers standing beside them. Did my dad do something wrong? The words settled over the lobby like silence after thunder. One of the officers shifted his weight almost immediately. The older of the 2 glanced briefly toward Victor, then back at Daniel. Something about the situation no longer felt routine. Around the lobby, people had stopped pretending not to watch. And for the first time that night, Victor realized he wasn't just being observed by Daniel anymore. Everyone was watching him. Victor's expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough for Daniel to notice. The confidence was still there. But something underneath it had begun to crack. Not because he believed he was wrong. Because the room was no longer moving with him. People were watching now. Not Daniel. Him. He felt it. The guests near the lounge had stopped pretending to mind their own business. The businessman who had lowered his newspaper never picked it back up. Even Tyler stood unusually still behind the reception desk. Victor drew a slow breath. Then his voice lost what little warmth it still carried. This has gone on long enough. He turned toward the two security officers. Please escort them out. Neither officer moved immediately. It lasted less than a second. But Daniel noticed. He noticed the brief glance they exchanged. The silent hesitation. Then training took over. The older officer stepped forward first. The younger followed. Daniel rose carefully from the chair, making sure not to jostle Ethan. The little boy slipped one arm around his father's neck, still holding Oliver tightly against his chest. Daniel didn't resist. He didn't argue. He didn't take a single step toward the exit either. He simply stood in the middle of the lobby, looking calmly at Victor. It wasn't the look of a defeated man. It was the look of someone who had finally seen everything he came to see. Around the lobby, phones had quietly begun to appear. No one held them high. No one wanted to attract attention. But more than one camera was now pointed in Daniel's direction. Not because anyone expected a fight. Because something about the scene no longer felt ordinary. A father. A sleeping child now barely awake. Two security officers. A general manager who seemed completely certain he was doing the right thing. Daniel reached into the pocket of his faded hoodie. Tyler immediately stiffened. One of the officers instinctively shifted his footing. Daniel simply removed his phone. Nothing more. He unlocked it. Scrolled once. Then pressed a single contact. The call connected almost immediately. Daniel spoke quietly. I'm at the Royal Crest. He listened. They've refused me a room. Another pause. Come to the main lobby. That was all. He ended the call, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and rested one reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. Ethan looked up at him. Dad, is someone coming? Daniel smiled. Yes, buddy. Then he looked back at Victor. They're already on their way. Victor almost laughed. Not because the words were amusing. Because he had heard them before. They are on their way. Guests said things like that all the time. Lawyers. Friends. Police officers. Someone important. It rarely changed anything. Victor folded his hands in front of him. We'll wait, he said evenly. But you'll still have to leave. Daniel didn't answer. He simply rested one hand on Ethan's shoulder. The little boy leaned against him, still sleepy enough to trust that wherever his father stood was the safest place in the world. The silence stretched. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was expectant. Around the lobby, people stopped pretending they weren't watching. The businessman near the lounge quietly slipped his phone onto the table. Not to make a scene. Just in case. The concierge adjusted another stack of brochures she had already straightened twice. A housekeeper pushing a linen cart slowed as she entered the lobby. Then stopped completely. Nobody wanted to miss whatever happened next. Tyler tried to focus on his computer screen. He clicked through reservations, opened reports, closed them again. His eyes kept drifting back to the man in the faded hoodie. Something about him refused to fit. He wasn't angry. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He looked certain. Victor noticed it too. Confident people usually became defensive when security arrived. Daniel had become calmer. That bothered him more than shouting ever could. One of the security officers cleared his throat. Sir. His voice was respectful. If there's someone coming for you, maybe we can wait another minute. Victor turned sharply. We've already waited. The officer nodded. Yes, sir. But he didn't move. Neither did his partner. Neither wanted to be the first person to place a hand on a father holding a child. Especially not in front of a lobby full of witnesses. Ethan looked up at Daniel. Dad. Yeah, buddy. Is everybody upset? Daniel smiled gently. Some people are confused. Ethan thought about that. Then he asked the kind of question only a 7-year-old could ask. Will they feel better when your friend gets here? Daniel looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded. I think everyone will understand a little more. The answer puzzled Tyler. Your friend. Who could possibly be coming at this hour? A lawyer. A police officer. Someone from corporate. Victor checked his watch. 1 minute. Then 2. Nothing happened. His confidence returned. He looked toward the security officers. That's enough. His voice hardened. Escort Mr. Brooks off the property. Daniel didn't react. Not immediately. Instead, he looked around the lobby one slow time. Every employee. Every guest. Every face. He wasn't looking with anger. He was memorizing. Years from now, most of these people would remember this night. The question was, what exactly would they remember? Then, a soft chime echoed through the lobby. It was only the sound of the elevator arriving. Normally, no one would have noticed. Tonight, every head turned. The stainless steel doors slid open. One person stepped out. Then another. Then a third. All 3 wore business suits. Not expensive enough to attract attention. Not ordinary enough to be ignored. They walked with purpose. Not hurried. Not slow. Straight toward Daniel. Victor frowned. Tyler looked up from the desk. The entire lobby seemed to hold its breath. The man in front stopped a few feet away from Daniel. Without looking at Victor. Without looking at Tyler. Without acknowledging anyone else in the room. He faced Daniel directly. His expression carried the unmistakable weight of someone who knew exactly who stood before him. Then, in a voice calm enough to make the silence even heavier, he spoke. Mr. Brooks. I'm sorry we didn't reach you before this happened. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Tyler blinked. Victor's expression didn't change, but the color slowly drained from his face. Because for the first time that night, someone had addressed the man in the faded hoodie, with the respect reserved for the person at the very top, and the realization spreading across the lobby, was only the beginning. The words hung in the air. Mr. Brooks. I'm sorry we didn't reach you before this happened. No one moved. Not Daniel. Not Victor. Not Tyler. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy. The kind of silence that forces every person in a room to question what they thought they knew only seconds before. Ethan looked up at his father, then at the 3 men standing in front of him, then back at Daniel. He tugged gently on his father's sleeve. Dad, you know them. For the first time since they had walked through the revolving doors. Daniel smiled. Not a proud smile. Not a victorious one. Just the tired smile of a father whose son had been awake far longer than he should have been. Yeah, buddy. I know them. The little boy nodded as if that explained everything. To him. It did. He rested his head back against Daniel's shoulder and hugged Oliver a little tighter. Around the lobby. No one seemed to remember how to breathe. Victor remained exactly where he was. Only moments ago, he had been giving instructions. Now, he was trying to understand why 3 senior executives had walked past everyone else, without acknowledging him. Tyler felt his mouth go dry. He looked from Daniel to the executives, then back again. His mind searched desperately for another explanation. Maybe they knew each other socially. Maybe Daniel was an investor. Maybe. But every possibility disappeared the moment the oldest executive spoke again. His voice remained calm. Respectful. Mr. Brooks. The board has been trying to reach you since your flight landed. We didn't realize you had come directly here. Another long silence followed. One of the security officers slowly took a step backward. Not because anyone told him to. Because instinct suddenly reminded him that he was standing between 2 company executives, and the man they were addressing with unmistakable respect. His younger partner quietly did the same. Neither wanted to be remembered as the officer who tried to escort the owner of the hotel out of his own lobby. Across the room, the guests who had been recording lowered their phones. Not completely. Just enough to look over the tops of their screens. This no longer felt like an argument. It felt like history unfolding in real time. Daniel looked around the lobby. His eyes moved from face to face. The concierge. the bell attendant, the security officers. Tyler finally. Victor. He wasn't looking with satisfaction. He wasn't looking with anger. He was taking inventory. Who had spoken? Who had stayed silent? Who had followed orders without asking questions? And who had quietly hesitated when something didn't feel right? Because moments like these revealed far more than performance reviews ever could. Victor finally found his voice. He cleared his throat. I'm afraid there's been some kind of misunderstanding. No one answered him. Not immediately. Even the executives remained silent. The explanation sounded smaller now than it had only a minute earlier. Daniel shifted Ethan gently in his arms. The little boy had nearly fallen asleep again. His cheek rested against Daniel's shoulder. His fingers still clutched the worn stuffed elephant as though nothing extraordinary was happening around him. Daniel looked at the executive standing before him. Then he spoke for the first time since the truth had begun revealing itself. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. How long? He asked quietly, has this become acceptable inside my hotels? And somehow, that question frightened Victor far more than hearing Daniel's title ever could. Because it wasn't the question of an angry customer. It was the question of the man who had built everything standing around them. And everyone in the lobby knew. The hardest conversation of the night was only just beginning. The question settled over the lobby with surprising weight. How long? Daniel repeated quietly. Has this become acceptable inside my hotels? No one answered. Not because they didn't hear him. Because everyone understood that whatever came next would matter. Victor cleared his throat. His voice returned before his confidence did. Mr. Brooks. I'd like to explain. He took one careful step forward. Not with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had won, but with the cautious attention of someone taking inventory of every word that could still save him. He wasn't thinking about what he wanted to say. He was thinking about what this moment actually was, and what it required of him. Tyler found his voice first, which was either brave or foolish. Tonight, it was probably both. Mr. Brooks, he said quietly, we had no way of knowing who you were. Each sentence began with confidence, and seemed to lose it before reaching the end. He wasn't lying. Not exactly. He genuinely hadn't known. But Daniel had spent enough years building hotels to understand something Tyler still hadn't learned. Not knowing who someone is never the same thing as treating them without dignity. Daniel understood that. So did nearly everyone standing in the lobby. Tyler's words faded into silence. Daniel let him finish. He didn't interrupt. He didn't change his expression. He simply listened. Until there were no words left. Then, he spoke. You're right. The admission surprised everyone. Tyler blinked. Victor looked confused. Daniel nodded once. You didn't know who I was. He paused. That, he said quietly, is actually the whole point. His voice carried through the lobby without effort. Not because he raised it, but because everything else had become so quiet. He slowly looked around the room. Everything that happened tonight. You did because you looked at me and decided I wasn't worth your standard. Not because of anything I said. Not because of anything I did. But because of what I looked like when I walked through those doors. His eyes lowered toward Ethan. And you did it. In front of my son. No one spoke. Even Ethan remained silent, still resting against his father's shoulder. Daniel looked back at Victor. My father worked overnight security in a hotel for 22 years. He came home every morning carrying something heavier than exhaustion. The weight of being dismissed. By people who had already decided he didn't matter before he ever opened his mouth. A long silence followed. I built Brooks Hospitality because I believed hotels could be different. I believed that every person deserved to be welcomed before they were judged. His eyes settled on Tyler. But somewhere, that belief stopped reaching this front desk. Tyler swallowed hard-eye. He whispered, I'm sorry. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked a question. One that sounded almost gentle. When that couple walked through those doors, you found them a room in less than 3 minutes. He looked directly at Tyler. Where did that room come from? Tyler's face lost what little color remained. He glanced toward Victor. Only for a second. But it was enough. Daniel noticed. So did everyone else. Victor stepped in quickly. It was management discretion. Daniel turned slowly. Was it? Victor hesitated. It was an operational decision. Daniel nodded once. So the hotel wasn't full. Victor opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The silence answered for him. Around the lobby, the guests exchanged quiet glances. One of the security officers lowered his eyes. The older executive standing beside Daniel remained perfectly still. He had attended hundreds of corporate meetings. None of them had revealed as much as this single conversation. Daniel looked toward the concierge. She quickly straightened. "What is your name, Maya? Sir, were we fully booked tonight?" Maya froze. She looked toward Victor, then toward Daniel. Her answer could cost someone a career, perhaps even her own. Daniel noticed the fear. "You won't be punished for telling the truth." His voice remained calm. "You have my word." Maya took a slow breath. Then she answered, "No. So there were 12 rooms available. No one moved." Tyler slowly closed his eyes. Victor's shoulders dropped almost imperceptibly. The truth no longer belonged to Daniel. It belonged to the room. And everyone inside it had just heard the same thing. Daniel didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. Instead, he asked the one question Victor had been hoping would never come. "How many times," he said quietly, "has this happened before?" The lobby fell silent again because everyone suddenly realized. This night was no longer about one father or one receptionist. It was about an entire culture that had been hiding in plain sight. And Daniel Brooks had only just begun uncovering it. The question settled over the lobby like a weight no one wanted to carry. How many times has this happened before? No one answered. Not Tyler, not Victor, not even Maya, because everyone standing there understood something that had never crossed their minds before. This night was no longer about one mistake. Daniel stood quietly with Ethan asleep against his shoulder. His son had fallen back into a peaceful sleep, completely unaware that the building surrounding him existed because of the man carrying him. Daniel gently adjusted the little blanket that had slipped from Ethan's shoulder. Then he looked back at Victor. "I asked you a question." Victor swallowed. His polished confidence had disappeared. He glanced briefly toward Tyler, then toward Maya. As though someone else might answer for him, nobody did. Finally, Victor spoke. "I don't know, sir." Daniel studied him for several seconds. "You don't know, or you've never asked." The distinction landed harder than the question itself. Victor lowered his eyes. He realized he had spent years measuring occupancy rates, guest satisfaction scores, revenue, luxury rankings. But he had never once stopped to ask how many people had quietly walked away feeling unwelcome. Daniel noticed the realization settling over him. He wasn't interested in humiliating Victor. He wanted him to understand. Because understanding lasts longer than embarrassment. Tyler suddenly found his voice, barely above a whisper. "Mr. Brooks." Daniel looked at him. Tyler struggled to hold Daniel's gaze. "I've been telling myself all night that I didn't know who you were." He stopped, then slowly shook his head. "But that's not true." His voice cracked. "The truth is, I decided who you were." The lobby became even quieter. Tyler took a slow breath. "When you walked in, I saw the hoodie. I saw the worn jeans. I saw that your son was asleep on your shoulder. I told myself you probably couldn't afford to stay here." He looked down at the marble floor. "I never checked. I never asked. I just assumed." Daniel listened without interrupting. That made it harder. Much harder. Because Tyler wasn't defending himself anymore. He was confronting himself. Daniel finally spoke. "Do you know what the most expensive thing in this hotel is?" Tyler looked up, confused. "No, sir. It isn't the marble. It isn't the chandeliers. It isn't the presidential suite." He paused. "It's trust." He slowly looked around the lobby. "Every guest who walks through these doors gives us something before they ever hand over a credit card. They trust us. They trust that they'll be treated with dignity. They trust that their family will be safe. They trust that they'll be welcomed." His eyes returned to Tyler. "Tonight, you spent that trust as though it belonged to you." Tyler's eyes filled. "I'm sorry." Daniel nodded gently. "I believe you are." Another silence followed. Not awkward. Reflective. Then Daniel turned toward Maya. "You've been here the entire time." "Yes, sir." He studied her expression. You looked uncomfortable. Maya hesitated, then answered honestly. I was. Why didn't you say anything? She looked down. Because he was my manager. And I told myself. It wasn't my place. Daniel nodded once. I appreciate your honesty. He let those words settle. Then he quietly asked, if you saw this happen again tomorrow, what would you do? Maya didn't answer immediately. She thought about Ethan, about the little stuffed elephant, about the question the boy had asked. Why do they want us to go? Her eyes slowly lifted. I'd speak up. Daniel kept looking at her. Even if it cost you your job. She took a long breath, then nodded. Yes, sir. Daniel smiled for the first time that evening. Not because anyone had made a mistake. Because someone had chosen courage. Good. That's the answer I was hoping to hear. Around the lobby, employees quietly exchanged glances. The conversation had changed. This no longer felt like an investigation. It felt like a lesson every person in the room would remember. One of the older security officers finally stepped forward. His voice was respectful. Mr. Brooks. Daniel turned toward him. I'm sorry. Daniel waited. The officer continued. When we got the call, I believed I was responding to a difficult guest. He glanced at Ethan. But when your little boy asked whether you'd done something wrong, he paused. I knew something wasn't right. Daniel nodded slowly. I noticed. The officer looked surprised. You hesitated. Daniel said it matter-of-factly. You were following instructions. But your conscience arrived before your hands did. The officer lowered his head. Thank you, sir. Daniel looked around the lobby one more time. Every employee was watching him now. Not because he owned the hotel. Because they wanted to know what happened next. Daniel finally broke the silence. I've spent 12 years building Brooks Hospitality. I've inspected kitchens. I've inspected guest rooms. I've inspected financial reports. He paused. But tonight, I discovered something I've neglected to inspect. Victor slowly lifted his eyes. Daniel looked directly at him. Our culture. No one spoke. Daniel's voice remained calm. And culture isn't revealed during board meetings. It reveals itself. At 11:30 at night, when a tired father carrying a sleeping child quietly asks for a room, he rested one hand gently on Ethan's back. And whether that father owns the hotel, or has just enough money for one night stay, should never change the answer. The words settled over the lobby. Deep. Unavoidable. Then Daniel looked toward the 3 executives who had arrived earlier. I want a complete review of every complaint involving discrimination, profiling, or guest treatment from every Brooks property. He paused. Not next month. Not next week. Starting tonight. One of the executives nodded immediately. Yes, Mr. Brooks. Daniel continued. I also want anonymous interviews with every overnight employee. No supervisors present. No retaliation. If anyone has stayed silent because they were afraid. That ends now. The executive nodded again. It'll be done. Victor closed his eyes. He was beginning to understand. Daniel hadn't come looking for someone to punish. He had come looking for the truth. And now, the truth was about to travel far beyond the walls of the Royal Crest Hotel. Meanwhile, Ethan stirred slightly against his father's shoulder. His sleepy voice broke the silence. Dad. Daniel smiled down at him. Yeah, buddy. The little boy rubbed one eye. Can we finally go to bed now? A few quiet smiles appeared around the lobby. Daniel gently brushed Ethan's hair back from his forehead. Yes. We are finally going to get some sleep. But before anyone could move, Daniel looked back toward the front desk one last time. His next question would determine not just Tyler's future, but the future of everyone who worked inside Brooks Hospitality. Daniel's eyes moved across the lobby. Then they settled on Maya. She had remained behind the concierge desk through all of it. Her hands rested quietly on the polished counter. She wasn't pretending to organize brochures anymore. She wasn't pretending not to watch. She simply stood there, waiting, not knowing whether she had done enough, or not nearly enough. Daniel shifted Ethan gently against his shoulder before walking toward her. The lobby remained silent. Every employee watched him cross the marble floor. Maya straightened instinctively. Not out of fear. Out of respect. Daniel stopped a few feet away. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that only she could hear. You saw what was happening. Maya nodded. Yes, sir. You knew something wasn't right. Another quiet nod. Yes. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Why didn't you say anything? Maya's fingers tightened slightly against the counter. She didn't search for an excuse. She searched for the truth. I was afraid. Her voice barely carried. I kept telling myself that Mr. Hayes had already made the decision. She swallowed. I thought. It wasn't my place. Daniel listened without interrupting. Then he nodded once. I understand. The words caught Maya off guard. Daniel continued. When leadership creates an environment where good people are afraid to speak, that's a failure of leadership before it's ever a failure of character. Maya slowly looked up. Daniel's expression hadn't hardened. If anything, it had softened. I watched you tonight. He continued quietly. You never stopped paying attention. You noticed the inconsistency. You noticed the empty rooms. You noticed the discomfort on the faces around you. He paused. And when I promised you that telling the truth wouldn't cost you your job, you told the truth. Maya felt her eyes begin to fill. I just answered your question. Daniel gave a faint smile. No. You answered it honestly. There's a difference. Behind them. The lobby remained completely still. Nobody wanted to interrupt. Nobody wanted to miss a word. Daniel glanced briefly toward the executives. Then back at Maya. Starting tomorrow, I want you reporting directly to guest relations. Maya blinked. She wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. Daniel continued. You'll begin leadership training. You'll work alongside our regional guest experience team. And when a guest needs someone willing to speak up, I want that person to be you. Maya opened her mouth. No words came. Finally, she managed to whisper. Sir, are you sure? Daniel smiled. I'm not promoting you because you were perfect tonight. I'm promoting you because I saw integrity before I saw confidence. And confidence can be taught. A single tear escaped before Maya quietly wiped it away. I won't let you down. Daniel nodded. I know. For a moment. Neither of them spoke. Then Daniel turned back toward the lobby. Every employee's eyes followed him. The guests who had remained were no longer pretending to mind their own business. Their phones had disappeared. Now, they were simply listening. Daniel stood in the center of the lobby, still wearing the faded hoodie, still carrying his sleeping son, still looking more like an exhausted father than the owner of one of the city's finest hotels. He didn't climb onto a platform. He didn't raise his voice. He simply spoke. I've spent 12 years building Brooks Hospitality. His words echoed gently through the quiet room. I've inspected budgets. I've inspected guest rooms. I've inspected construction sites. I've inspected financial reports. He paused. But tonight, I inspected something far more important. He looked around the lobby, the heart of this hotel. No one moved. Daniel continued. Luxury isn't measured by chandeliers. It isn't measured by marble floors. And it certainly isn't measured by the clothes someone wears when they walk through our doors. His eyes drifted toward Tyler. Then Victor. Then every employee standing nearby. The only standard I've never been willing to negotiate is respect. He let the words settle. Every person who walks into one of my hotels deserves to feel welcome. Before they've earned it. Before we've checked their reservation. Before we've seen their credit card. And before we've decided whether they look like they belong. Silence. Deep. Uncomfortable. Honest silence. Daniel looked down at Ethan. The little boy stirred slightly but didn't wake. One small hand still clutched Oliver tightly against his chest. Daniel gently adjusted the blanket around him. Then looked back at everyone. Tonight, my son asked a question. His voice became quieter. He asked why people wanted us to leave. The words hung in the air. I hope none of you ever have to answer that question to another child. Nobody looked away. Because every person standing there understood that this wasn't the end of the conversation. It was the beginning of a different hotel. And by sunrise, Everyone who worked inside the Royal Crest would know exactly what had happened in the lobby that night. But one employee still hadn't spoken. Tyler stood frozen behind the front desk, staring at the polished countertop, knowing that the hardest moment of his life was only seconds away. The silence around him felt louder than any argument could have. He slowly lifted his head. His eyes met Daniel's for the first time without defensiveness, without excuses, without pride. "I'm sorry." The words were barely audible. Not because he wanted sympathy, because they were heavy. Daniel didn't interrupt. Tyler swallowed hard. "When you walked through those doors tonight, I didn't see a tired father carrying his little boy." His voice trembled. "I saw your clothes. I saw your hoodie. I saw your worn jeans. And before you even spoke, I decided you didn't belong here." He lowered his eyes again. "I didn't deny you a room because the hotel was full. I denied you because I judged you." The confession settled over the lobby. No one moved. Even Victor kept his eyes fixed on the floor. Tyler continued. "I've been telling myself that I didn't know you owned this hotel." He shook his head slowly. "But that isn't the truth. The truth is, even if you had been an ordinary guest, I still should have treated you with respect. I failed you." He looked toward Ethan, who was sleeping peacefully on Daniel's shoulder, still holding Oliver close against his chest. "And I failed your son." For several seconds, Daniel said nothing. He simply looked at Tyler, not as an owner looking at an employee, as a father looking at another human being who had finally stopped hiding behind excuses. Finally, Daniel spoke. "Do you know what hurt the most tonight?" Tyler answered quietly. "No, sir. It wasn't being refused a room. It wasn't being embarrassed. And it wasn't having security called." Daniel looked down at Ethan. "It was watching my son ask why we weren't welcome." His voice remained calm. No child should ever wonder whether they belong because of the way their parent looks. Tyler closed his eyes. The words struck deeper than any punishment could. Daniel continued. "When I founded Brooks Hospitality, I wrote one sentence that every manager received on their first day." Victor slowly looked up. Daniel recited it from memory. "People will forget the size of their room. They will forget what they ate. But they will never forget how we made them feel." His eyes swept across the lobby. "Tonight, we failed that promise." He turned toward the three executives. "I've made my decision." Every employee straightened instinctively. Daniel's voice remained steady. "Effective immediately. Victor Hayes is relieved of his duties as general manager of the Royal Crest Hotel." Victor closed his eyes. He didn't argue. He knew there was nothing left to defend. Daniel continued. "An investigation will determine whether this pattern exists elsewhere under his leadership." One of the executives nodded. "It will begin tonight, Mr. Brooks." Daniel then looked at Tyler. Tyler's breathing became shallow. He already knew what was coming. "Tyler," Daniel said quietly, "this company was built on trust. You broke that trust tonight." Tyler nodded. "I know." Daniel paused before continuing. "You are no longer employed by Brooks Hospitality." The words were firm, but never cruel. Tyler lowered his head. "I understand." He slowly removed his name badge. For a moment, he simply looked at it. Only hours earlier, he had pinned it on without a second thought. Now it felt heavier than it ever had before. He placed it carefully on the reception desk. "I'm sorry, Mr. Brooks." Daniel nodded. "I believe you are." Tyler looked surprised. Daniel continued. "But remorse only matters when it changes the person who feels it." Tyler wiped his eyes. "It will." Without another word, he quietly walked away from the front desk. No one celebrated. No one applauded. Because this wasn't a victory. It was a lesson that had come at a painful cost. Daniel then turned toward the security officers. "I want to thank both of you." The older officer looked surprised. "Sir, you followed instructions," Daniel said. "But you never forgot your humanity." He smiled faintly. I noticed the hesitation. The officer nodded. "I couldn't bring myself to put my hands on a father carrying his child." Daniel extended his hand. "You chose compassion." The officer shook it. "Thank you, sir." Daniel then faced every employee still standing in the lobby. "I want every person here to remember something." He paused. There will always be someone wealthier than you. There will always be someone more powerful than you. But dignity costs nothing to give. His eyes moved slowly around the room. The person standing in front of you may own the building. They may be working 3 jobs just to afford one night stay. They may have saved for years to celebrate an anniversary. They may have just buried someone they love. You don't know their story. And that's exactly why you treat everyone with respect. The lobby remained silent. Daniel gently shifted Ethan, who stirred slightly before settling back against his shoulder. The little boy whispered sleepily, "Dad." Daniel smiled. "Yeah, buddy. Can we go to our room now?" A few quiet smiles appeared around the lobby. Daniel kissed the top of Ethan's head. "Yes. We are finally going to our room." One of the executives stepped forward. "Mr. Brooks, the presidential suite has already been prepared." Daniel smiled politely. "Thank you." Then he shook his head. "No." The executive looked confused. Daniel glanced toward the reception desk. "Book us into a standard room." The executive blinked. "Sir." Daniel nodded. "The same room I asked for when I walked through those doors. If it was good enough then, it's good enough now." No one spoke, because everyone understood. Daniel hadn't come to prove he was important. He had come to prove that every guest was. As he walked toward the elevators with Ethan sleeping peacefully in his arms, every employee instinctively stepped aside, not because they feared the owner, but because they had finally seen the kind of leader he truly was. And before the elevator doors closed, Daniel turned back one last time. "I don't want people to remember the Royal Crest Hotel as the place where a father was judged." He looked at every face in the lobby. "I want them to remember it as the place where we chose to become better." The elevator doors slid shut. The lobby remained silent long after they disappeared, because everyone standing there knew. The Royal Crest Hotel would open the next morning under the same name, but it would never be the same hotel again. Tyler stood frozen behind the front desk, staring at the polished countertop, knowing that the hardest moment of his life was only seconds away. He slowly looked up. His eyes met Daniel's for the first time since the truth had come out. "I don't have an excuse," he said quietly. His voice barely carried across the silent lobby. "I kept telling myself I was protecting the hotel standards." He shook his head. "But the truth is I was protecting my own assumptions." No one interrupted him. "I never asked your name. I never checked the system. I never gave you the same chance I gave that other couple." He swallowed hard. "I decided who you were before you said more than one sentence." The words lingered in the air. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He shifted Ethan slightly higher on his shoulder as the little boy slept peacefully, still hugging Oliver against his chest. Then Daniel spoke. "Do you know what hurts the most?" Tyler slowly shook his head. "It isn't that you turned me away." Daniel's voice remained calm. "It isn't even that you embarrass me." He glanced down at Ethan. "It's that my son watched adults decide whether he belonged before they ever knew him." The lobby fell silent again. Several employees lowered their eyes. One of the security officers quietly exhaled. Daniel looked around the Royal Crest Hotel. The marble floors, the chandeliers, the carefully chosen artwork. Years ago, he had approved every detail because he believed beautiful buildings could create memorable experiences. Tonight reminded him that buildings never created hospitality. People did. He turned toward Maya. She remained at the concierge desk, watching everything unfold. Throughout the night she had said little. But she had watched. She had listened. And when she was finally asked the truth, she told it. Daniel nodded toward her. "Maya." "Yes, sir." "When that family walks through these doors tomorrow." He paused. "The one that's tired from traveling. The parents carrying more bags than they can manage. The child who's too exhausted to smile. How should they be welcomed?" Maya answered without hesitation. "The same way every guest should be welcomed." She smiled softly. "Before they've proved anything." Daniel returned the smile. "Exactly." For the first time that night, the tension in the lobby eased. Not because anyone had forgotten what happened. Because everyone finally understood what should have happened. Daniel slowly walked toward the entrance. The executives followed a respectful distance behind. The employees watched in complete silence. Just before reaching the revolving doors, Daniel stopped. Without turning around, He spoke one final time. "I built the Royal Crest Hotel to give people a place where they could rest." He glanced at Ethan sleeping peacefully against his shoulder. Not a place where they had to prove they deserved to. He looked back at the employees. Luxury isn't the feeling guests get when they see marble floors. It's the feeling they get when they're treated with dignity. Remember that. And everything else will take care of itself. No one spoke. No one needed to. The lesson had already settled into every corner of the lobby. As Daniel carried Ethan toward the elevators to finally get the room they had needed all along, Maya watched them disappear from view. She quietly looked around the lobby. Nothing about the building had changed. The same lights still glowed. The same piano music still floated through the air. The same marble floors reflected the chandeliers above. Yet somehow, the Royal Crest Hotel already felt different, because everyone standing there understood one simple truth. Respect should never depend on appearance. Every guest deserves dignity before they've earned anyone's approval. And that was the standard Daniel Brooks had intended from the very beginning.